whatever. Hello and welcome. Welcome to everybody online. Welcome to everyone in person for this lovely session, 18th and 19th centuries in the history of science. My name is Dani Inkpen. I'm chair for this session. One piece of housekeeping, unfortunately, Capital Raj is not going to be able to make it to this session, so we are down a speaker, which means that we have a bit of more time for questions and fun at the end, and we're going to be a bit more lenient with our speakers in terms of how long they talk for. Though I can imagine it's hard to pivot on a dime and to extend your talk by terribly long. So our first speaker is joining us virtually. Victoria Dickenson from McGill University is going to be speaking about full circle reimagining nature in 18th century Saint-Domingue. So without further ado, Victoria, please take it away.
Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everything will go just fine.
Looks good.
Okay. Can you see the screen, everyone?
Yes.
Yes? Great. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. I am speaking to you virtually, thanks to Air Canada, from the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has now been erased forever. We acknowledge the island of Aotearoa, or Newfoundland, as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. The material presented today is part of our SSHRC-funded Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada funded partnership development project at the McGill University Library, Hidden Hands in Colonial Natural History Collections. The 4 case studies in this project examine materials held in McGill, looking for the unnamed collaborators who made possible the collections of objects, paintings, and specimens attributed to European collectors and artists. Oops. Sorry. There. Each case study is grounded in material culture. The Saint-Domingue case study, in which I've been working, examines 4 albums of natural history watercolors attributed to René Gabriel de Rabier, a French engineer who arrived in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, in 1742. The albums themselves are held in the Blackerwood Natural History Collection at McGill University and have been digitized and made available on Internet Archive. And you can see the, I hope you can see my cursor, but the site is there on Internet Archive. An important part of this project is the complete documentation of these albums, including identification of species by scientific and common names in English, French, and Creole, plus full transcriptions and translation of the commentaries on the watercolors and their attribution. The complete catalog will be made available on McGill Archive site in 2024. You can see here just images from the 4 albums, plus the annotations in a variety of hands, which are written on the back of the watercolors. This project has been made possible by the collaboration of a network of researchers and student research assistants, which includes biologists in Canada, Haiti, the US, Italy, and Barbados, historians, linguists, art historians, artists, and literary scholars in Canada, Haiti, France, and the US. So what can we learn by looking at pictures of plants and animals painted by an amateur naturalist and never published? What can be teased out of these images and their handwritten notes? And does this material have any place in the history of the circulation of scientific knowledge? I'd like to explore these questions by looking briefly today at 5 different kinds of circulation in keeping with the theme of the conference: people, plants and animals, objects and specimens, knowledge, and the container of that, the albums. And just to your right is a detail from a map by René de Rabier that's in the British Library. So just a little vignette of a ship of the period. To begin with, I think it's important to know something of 18th century Saint-Domingue. The island of Hispaniola was encountered by Columbus on his first voyage, colonized by the Spanish and then by the French, who inhabited the western half of the island. The Spanish and the French colonizers transformed the landscape. They cleared the lowlands, irrigated them, planted them in great sugar plantations, and hacked out smaller holdings for indigo, cacao, and in the highlands, coffee, all made possible through enslaved labor. Cap Français, now Cap Haïtien, where René de Rabier lived from 1742 to 1784, was the principal urban settlement. And here is a watercolor of Le Cap in 1833. Thanks to the sugar trade and enslaved labor, Saint-Domingue became the richest colony in the Caribbean. While distant, it was not isolated from France. Despite the length of the Atlantic crossing, anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, ships arrived every day with foods, wines, products from France for sale in the markets of Le Cap, as it was called, and returned with the sugar, coffee, and other products that made French planters rich. And here you can see from James McClellan's wonderful work, 1,200 sailings a year, 680 ships arriving from France, 527 departing. By 1786, when this map was drawn, Le Cap was called the Pearl of the Antilles, a European geometry of churches, gardens, squares, fountains, and public buildings, many designed by René de Rabier and surrounded by the mangroves of the coast and backed by the high forested moorns or uplands. So, turning to people. Beyond his work as an accomplished cartographer and engineer, little is known of de Rabier, the artist-naturalist who drew the plants, insects, birds, and fish. Even less is known of the other hands who annotated the watercolors and collected and prepared the specimens. As Mary Terrell has noted in her biographical work, biography itself is a useful tool in finding the imperfect traces, she calls them, of the people who contributed and what they knew. So starting with de Rabier, what made a French engineer collect specimens, acquire materials, and paint the flora and fauna of Haiti? First, René Gabriel was born in 1717 in Rochefort in France. And Rochefort was one of the great ports for the Caribbean trade. Economic botany was an important part of France's colonial enterprise. And even before he sailed for Saint-Domingue, Rabier would have been seeing Caribbean plants in the botanical garden, begun by Michel Bégon, who was once the intendant of Saint-Domingue and who ended as the intendant of Rochefort. The garden was established in 1741, just before René Gabriel would have sailed. Rochefort was also a slaving port, and René Gabriel would have seen enslaved people passing through. Here's a timeline. I think it's important always, I feel, to put things in time. And here's René Gabriel's life from, he was 25 when he arrived in Le Cap. And here he met and married around 1747. There are no records for Le Cap before about 1770 due to a fire. But we do know that around 1747, he married Anne Lebon. She was a Creole. And in Saint-Domingue at this period, Creole was a term used for someone born in the colony, someone who knew the local productions. Their eldest daughter, Jacquette Anne-Marie, who would play a part in this story, was born in 1750. There were 4 other children. Jacquette Anne-Marie was married at 16, and her son, Armand Gabriel, born in 1767. Her father begins to paint in that same year. Jacquette was widowed at 21, and her son became the ward of his grandfather, and they moved to his house in Le Cap. In 1777, Jacquette herself begins to paint watercolors of birds. She's copying her father's natural history painting. And in 1782, she returns with her son to France when he is 15. With her drawings, and those drawings are now in the collections of the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, which is another part of the story in Paris. Finally, in 1784, René Gabriel returns to France with a woman of color called Marie, who was there to help him, and he dies less than 6 months later in Paris. The world of the Durabiers was not limited to Saint-Domingue, and when we think of where people learn things, we think about travel as part of that and meeting other people. This is just a brief glimpse of the travels of the Durabier family from 1742 to 1801. So René Gabriel sails first to Saint-Domingue, but he visits Mexico at the same time, and in his albums, there are, in fact, watercolors of Mexican insects. He then sails to France for a year for his health, and en route to France, he paints the fish that he sees at sea. So a number of his watercolors are annotated with en mer, to be painted on at sea. Jacquette and her son return in 1782. Her father returns 2 years later, but in 1786, Jacquette returns back to Saint-Domingue. So she's gone to France, she comes back. Armand Gabriel, her son, who has been serving in the army, also returns. Then, due to the incipient revolution in Haiti, they sail to Philadelphia. They return to France, but the terror comes in France. They return to Philadelphia, and then finally, sometime around 1800, Armand himself returns to France. So these are people who are involved. They're traveling to other places, they're meeting other people. And in Philadelphia, there is a lively center of Caribbean emigres, mainly from Haiti and other places, and a lively intellectual culture. So there's a lot of toing and froing in these crossings. They weren't the only ones making passages. Scholars estimate the total number of enslaved African peoples brought to the French Circum-Caribbean at over 1,118,000 people, and almost 800,000 of them came to Saint-Domingue. By the time of the Haitian Revolution, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue numbered over 709,000 people, most working on the plantations that grew sugar, coffee, and indigo, but many also serving as maids, butlers, and cooks, garçons et filles de jardin, the gardeners, fishers and hunters, and undoubtedly working with Durabier and his daughter to collect and prepare skins, acquire and feed insects and birds, hold animals still for painting, provide the local names for plants and animals, and of course, run to the Imprimerie Royale, where they sold books, paper, pens, inks, and paints brought from France. But people were not the only ones who made these crossings. Ships carried the animals and plants that were cultivated and used. And these are some of Durabier's drawings of some of those imports. European colonists began by importing their animals. So they brought pigs, horses, and cattle to Saint-Domingue. And Philip Morgan, in his work on the environmental history, says that as early as the 1520s, herds of as many as 8,000 cattle roamed the Hispaniolan countryside after their initial introduction in 1493. Europeans brought a new botany. They brought sugarcane and coffee that dominated the arable lands. And they brought the ubiquitous guinea fowl and Muscovy duck that scratched and swam in the planters' provisioning grounds. In France, people became familiar with the native fauna of Saint-Domingue, including captive birds, particularly macaws and parrots, and green and hawksbill sea turtles, which were captured in such quantities that their populations fell to less than 1% of their pre-Columbian numbers. The hawksbill sea turtles in particular their shells were used for marquetry and tortoiseshell headdresses and bracelets and brooches. So this is, there. This is not an image of the market in Le Cap, but I think it's very similar. There are descriptions of the market in Le Cap and a description of Saint-Domingue written by a French Creole settler called Moreau Saint-Marie. But this is the market in Martinique, painted by Le Mazurier in 1815. But what is very interesting in it is to see the amount of exchange of animals and plants going on. And this is where Durabier at the markets in Le Cap would have gotten many of his specimens. You can see in the middle section, if you can see my cursor, there's a white turtle lying on its back. And just behind the white turtle, much harder to see, are the ubiquitous guinea fowl. But I want to draw your attention to the young boy who is presenting for sale 5 captive birds, just in the middle of the image, and it's shown in the detail. On the ring sit a macaw, a red summer tanager, and a blue tanager, which came from northern South America. They're not native to Martinique. a red-crested cardinal, also from South America, and with the bird with the very long tail, the black sort of bird, is a widow bird, which is native to Senegal. This is a bird of the slave trade. And these birds, as well as people, were being taken across the oceans. Whoop, sorry. Animals, plants, and insects were transformed from living things into objects of collections. These were more easily shipped, traded, and cataloged. In 1784, de Rabier shipped his own collections back to Paris, where they had considerable value, as determined by the specialist evaluator François-Gilles Gaillard of Gaillard et Sœurs. The collections, though not the watercolors, were likely sold shortly after his death in 1785. So de Rabier's collections contain not only natural objects from Saint-Domingue, but also things like ostrich eggs and a Chinese parasol. You can see here the hummingbird nest that de Rabier may have taken back in one of his paintings, and he had quite a large collection of shells. He pinned his butterfly specimens under glass and mounted them in gold frames. There were 6 gilded frames of butterflies at the inventory after his death. And here are some he painted, and you can see he's painting the top surface and the lower surface of the butterflies. And these are really quite remarkable specimens, paintings. He also painted sloths in Saint-Domingue, where these were imported again from South America. And he obviously had seen them live, but when he went back to Paris, he took with him a stuffed and mounted sloth, which was part of his collection. To be clear, Rabier was not the only collector in Saint-Domingue at this period. And here's just an advertisement from Affiche Américain, which was the local newspaper, for a collection which was being sold by a Monsieur Frenet, who lived in Port-au-Prince, the other major city. And he's telling he has a très beau cabinet d'histoire naturelle. And his collection of shells is not only from Saint-Domingue, but from les Grandes Indes, the Indian Ocean Islands. So there's this huge exchange among the French colonial islands in terms of the circulation of materials. De Rabier was also not the only naturalist active in Saint-Domingue. Some local naturalists were, in fact, correspondents of the Paris scientific establishment. And the curators at the Jardin du Roi and later the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, they relied on the direct observations of some, but not all, local naturalists. There had been European naturalists who came and published about Saint-Domingue. These are some of the most famous. These books were available in the published literature, and they would have been likely available to René de Rabier in Saint-Domingue. So Charles Plumier, Père Labat, Père Nicholson, these are all speaking of the birds, plants, animals of Saint-Domingue. Plumier is basically a botanist. And that's one of his drawings on the left. There were, unlike some colonies which were very isolated, Saint-Domingue was receiving all this material. And here are at the Histoire Naturelle in 1771 and 1775. We see at the Imprimerie Royale in Port-au-Prince and in Le Cap. You can buy Monsieur Buffon, 19 volumes in duodecimo with birds, as well as 15 volumes in quarto size. So there were books available for someone like de Rabier, and it may well be that he was able to see these, though it's not clear that he did. De Rabier may also have met, however, with other European correspondents in Saint-Domingue. So André Chauvin, Duhamel, and Etienne Lefebvre-Desay were correspondents of the curators at the Paris Jardin du Roi. And there were other people there, like Le Roi de la Poterie, De la Haye, and the Maréchal d'Ode, who never published but made extended notes on their natural history of Saint-Domingue, which are available today in the archives in France. So there was this group of people. This later turned into a Cercle des Philadelphes, but at this period when de Rabier is there, that's not yet formed. But there's certainly a lively interest in natural history in this period in Saint-Domingue. René de Rabier's watercolors and their annotations, however, do reveal to us other kinds of knowledge. The Osée de Guinée, as the name suggests, is a hibiscus which is native to Africa. In Saint-Domingue, as in Africa, the leaves are eaten as a kind of spinach or made into sauce. In Saint-Domingue, the fruit was also made into preserve, and here's the annotation here. The fruit is acid and is made into confiture or preserves, which are very similar to currant jelly. And this comment, I think, is made by de Rabier's daughter. And she annotated these images with these kind of culinary notes, and she might have learned this from the enslaved cooks or confiseurs who served in her household. The knowledge of women and enslaved people also circulated, though it was rarely written down, but it informed how people saw the natural world as edible and often delicious. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the advance here. There. And despite the availability of the European text, de Rabier himself gave only common names to the plants and animals he painted, and many of these names were Creole names. Did de Rabier married into this large family, and did he learn from his wife or perhaps his mother-in-law or from the enslaved people who caught and kept his animals, birds and bugs? And here you can see a groove-billed Annie, which is called the bousse tabac in Creole, and de Rabier calls it the bout de tabac. I'm not quite sure it's called that way, more work to do, but it may be based on its call. But there it is, the bousse tabac. Finally, the Saint-Domingue albums were created by de Rabier and his families, informed by local experts, made possible by the work of enslaved servants. They survived fire, revolutions, transatlantic voyages, and even rebinding. They survived. So I just want to finish with a little look at what happened to the albums before they arrived in Montreal. So de Rabier worked on the albums from 1766 to 1784. His daughter copied some of the paintings in the albums. And surprisingly, there's a story around the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, which I'll come to, and her copies are in the museum. She inherited his watercolors after his death, and unlike his collections, the watercolors were not sold. They were annotated by Jacquette and her son sometime in the 1790s, perhaps when they were in Philadelphia, maybe when they were back together in Paris. And we know this because in one of the annotations, there are statistics on sugar imports from 1790, which is quoted in the text. And the handwriting is the handwriting of Armand Gabriel because his mother had an accident. She fell from a horse in 1780 and was paralyzed down her right side, so she could not write correctly. But in 1811, Jacquette Anne-Marie was so poor, so indigent, she offered for sale her father's watercolors to the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris. After 3 years of toing and froing, they were rejected by the curators as being out of date, though they did want to take and copy the insect drawings as being something they did not have. In the end, there are no insect drawings in the collections of the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris today, but there are Jacquette's copies of the birds. The albums were inherited by Armand Gabriel after his mother died in 1820. And then in around 1860, based on the end papers and the style of binding, they were compiled, trimmed, and bound by De La Rue, the papeterie on the Rue aux Deux Créoles in Paris. We don't know what happened to them for 70 years, but in 1930, Alexander Wetmore, who was the curator of ornithology at the Smithsonian, saw them at Weldon and Westley booksellers in London. He wrote to his friend Casey Wood, who loved anything to do with birds. Casey Wood immediately ordered them, and the albums arrived in Blacker Wood. Now the albums are returning full circle as their digitized images with rich metadata, new annotations are made possible through interdisciplinary collaborations. And that will return them and the images René Gabriel and his collaborators of all kinds to a place in the history of the natural history of Haiti. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. We, like I said, have a bit of time to work with. So are there any questions at this point for Victoria? We can also leave some time at the end. Let's see.
Thanks for this. This looks like an exciting project. You probably can't see me, but hopefully you can hear me. One of the things you didn't talk about was how he might have got information about the native plants and whether there was any relationship, any collaboration with Indigenous people on the island or people who had lived there before. You talk more about Europeans who are on the island. I just wondered if you have any insight into that.
At the time in Saint-Domingue, unfortunately, there were very few Native people left. The Indigenous people were almost completely wiped out during the Spanish colonization. There were a few. The people who were living in the French half of Hispaniola at the time were mainly the enslaved people from Africa and the European settlers and the Creole communities, which were very mixed communities. So the Le Bon family was a family that included what were called people of color. And these were people, for example, Anne Le Bon's uncle married a woman from Africa, and their children would have been called people of color. So they had a very broad, wide family, and they had been there generations. They had moved from Martinique, and they'd been in Saint-Domingue for about three generations. So these people knew the botany. I think what's interesting is when enslaved people came from Africa, they would bring with them their knowledge of West African plants. And some of the West African plants, like the roselle, came with them. The seeds came with them. What people learned then was this, there may have been some interaction between early French settlers and Indigenous Taino people, but it's not clear. But there was this understanding of this local botany. And what I think is interesting about, and I didn't go into this in great detail, but Jacquette Anne-Marie, she obviously cooked, or she spent time with the cooks and the confiseurs and the kitchens. And most of the families, including the Durabiers, had something called a place à vivre, or provisioning ground. These provisioning grounds were where the foodstuffs for the household were grown. So there were a lot of native plants used, and there were also imports from France, but a lot of the imports from France, particularly northern France, did not do well. So there evolved a whole new cuisine that was based on both native plants as well as some import plants. And so those plants coming from Africa, some of them came from South America, some of them came even from from North America, to be grown in this lush land where almost everything grew well, except the temperate. Apples did not do well, apparently. So there was indigenous knowledge. If it was passed on, it was passed on through these early Creole families. And then this interesting bringing in of West African knowledge and West African preparations. So there was a lot of the cuisine that is even today in Haiti had these roots both in Africa, but also in this use of the indigenous plants. I hope that answers some of your question. There are other islands where there was indigenous presence, but not in Hispaniola at this time, a strong indigenous presence, but not in Hispaniola.
I'd like to ask a question at this time. Edwin,
Yeah, thanks for that wonderful talk. I just wondered if you could maybe shed a bit more light on the values of things to do with natural history, particularly the specimens. But I was also intrigued by the book list that you showed of books entering the island, and I mean, you obviously explained the market of one as why your main actors were possessing them, but for a publisher to send book lists, it seems to me that they were sending multiple copies of such books. And I just wondered whether you could comment perhaps on the kind of people within the broader society who were actually purchasing these, and also to what extent did knowledge on natural history circulate more generally on the island?
Well, I think that's very interesting. There's not as much work on that as one would hope in this period. So there is in the 1790s, there's established around 1789, the Cercle des Philadelphes, which is regroups all the those interested. So it's a French institution. It's like an academy. And Charles Artaud, who is one of the founders, was Desrabier's doctor. So the Cercle de Philadelphia, it's the lawyers, the physicians, the government officials, les Grands Blancs, as they were known. Also, people of color who were extremely wealthy. So you have free people of color who are in many ways extremely wealthy, who are educated in France and come back to Saint-Domingue. They are the Creole. You have the French immigrants, the French settler immigrants who come over to serve in government positions. So this is a government outpost. It's a département of France. So it has all the bureaucratic structure of France. You have the beginnings of a botanic garden. Dirabier designs a garden. It's not really going until the 1790s. But there's a great deal of interest in natural history in France at this period. And you have the work of the Jardin de Roi, later the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle of Paris, which are sending out people looking for specimens. So these economic gardens, and they have these Jardins d'acclimatisation in France. So they're out there prospecting, as the English were, for plants, bringing them back to France. So there's a lot of interest, particularly in botany and natural history. The interest in insects is rarer. There's interest in foodstuffs. So Dirabier, I didn't show much of the fish albums, but he paints a huge number of fish and he talks about the gustatory qualities. You know, this is good, it's got firm flesh, it's white. You have, the birds were a big interest for a lot of people. And he paints a lot of birds. So there are 341 images all told. So lots of interest among the educated classes. The military as well, the engineers like Dirabier and others were also interested. So that's the group. And they wanted things from France. One of the Nicholson, Père Nicholson, who I mentioned, who is very disapproving of the secular interest in the luxuries available from France. And he talks about, you know, people are getting French cheese, French wine. They import their flour from France. They import, there are artists who come to Saint-Domingue to paint pictures. The dresses are imported from France. There's new shipments of silk stockings, all this kind of thing. And Nicholson is very disapproving of the luxuries. But among these things are books, paper, and ink and paints coming directly from France. So we've analyzed the paper Dirabier worked on. It's imported paper from the French mills that are established in Holland. So there's this big trade in fine paper at the time. And he's using fine paper. He's using laid paper, which he's buying. So in another project we worked on, looking at someone who's painting in Madras in India, and just a bit later on 1800, terrible difficulties getting paper, inks, and paints. Here, there seemed to be no problem. There's ship literally coming every day. So it was easy for him to get this. And it wasn't even so much book lists, it was literally what was on the shelves. So you could buy, different sizes of the Buffon. And you note the 1775 ad says with the birds, which was a later edition. And there are other natural history works as well, and a lot of works of medicine and a lot of legal works, because of course, a lot of the people there were a lot of avocats, there were a lot of people who were working in government who had legal training. So a great variety of books and novels, lots of novels. I hope that answers your question.
So, thank you.
We have a question online. Eileen, right? There we are.
Thanks. Am I unmuted this time?
Yes.
Yes, good. I was wondering about circulation within the French colonies, or perhaps even controversially to other people's colonies, because you've talked about from Saint-Domingue to France, but what about, within the Caribbean world? Got any evidence of that?
Yes, there is. As I mentioned, the Le Bon family, into which family René Gabriel married, had started off in Martinique, and then they moved to the southern part of Saint-Domingue, and then moved up into the north. So yes, there was a lot of that kind of between the French colonies in the French Caribbean. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's really interesting to me was finding these Mexican insects, and Dirabier notes their name. He talks about it's a praying mantis. He paints a lot of mantids, which are unusual. You don't see mantids much in France. They are there, but you don't see them as often. There are big ones in Saint-Domingue. And in Mexico, he finds one called the champamochi. He says in Mexico, in Campeche, they call this the champamochi. So I started to look into this, and it turns out, even though they were at war, the French engineers were so well respected that they were being literally imported to work on buildings and fortifications in Mexico. And so they were often sort of going from a Caribbean island to Mexico to do work and then coming back. Darabier may also have been the engineer on the botanical espionage mission by Menonville, who was looking for cochineal. They were very interested in the dyes. Could they grow the cochineal? The cochineal beetles feed on particular kind of cactus. Could they grow that in Saint-Domingue, and could they then have their own cochineal? They did try to do this, by the way. And so there was this big botanical espionage expedition. There's an engineer mentioned as being on the voyage. It may have been Darabier. We don't know. The other thing which I didn't show is he left a watercolor, which is in the Hispanic Society collection in New York City, of the Central Square in Mexico City. It's quite a beautiful watercolor. And he was a trained cartographer. The engineers at this time were trained. This is just prior to the School of Royal Engineering that was established, but he would have been trained in, as they were in the English engineers were trained in how to sketch fortifications, architectural drawing, really. And so there's a wonderful depiction of the square in 1766, the Zocalo in Mexico. So yes, I think there was a fair bit. And in fact, more than is recorded, because none of this is recorded, by the way. So one finds it from looking through the records of births, deaths, marriages, where you find out where people have come from, or finding these examples like the Champamochi from Campeche, which René Darabier obviously painted and perhaps brought back from Campeche.
It's fascinating. Thank you.
Super. Well, thank you very much again, Victoria. I think we're going to move on now. We're going to go all the way around the globe for our next talk by Edwin Rose from the University of Cambridge. He's going to be discussing exploration, empire, and the translation of knowledge on nature in Aotearoa.
Aotearoa, yeah.
Okay, close. In New Zealand, 1769 to 1813.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you to the conference organisers for facilitating my trip over here. So on the 9th of November, changing at all, there we go, 9th of November 1769, strange white sails were seen on the horizon as a large ship entered the port of Whatanga on the Coromandel Peninsula, New Zealand. In the early 1840s, the chief of this district gave an account of his childhood recollections of some of the first Europeans to visit Whatanga, when the captain of this ship, James Cook, renamed it to Mercury Bay in honour of his and Charles Green's observations of the transit of Mercury across the sun. And this is a picture that I took at the end of last year of this particular landing point. So among Tahareta's recollections was an account of a strange group who obsessed over collecting plants, animals, and minerals. To quote, they collected grasses from the cliffs and kept knocking at the stones on the beach and said, "Why are these acts done by these goblins? We and the women gathered stones and grass of all sorts and gave to these goblins. Some of the stones they liked and put them into their bags. The rest they threw away. And when we gave them grass and branches of trees, they stood and talked to us, or they uttered the words of their language. Perhaps they were asking questions, and as we did not know their language, we laughed, and these goblins also laughed, so we were pleased. The the word goblins, the descriptor goblins, is actually very interesting, and it comes from a direct translation of Williams's Maori dictionary, which came out just about the time of this particular quotation, and it actually has very, very complicated etymological root within Maori. I mean, also 200 odd years later, other sort of unfortunate historians of science ended up on this particular beach, which in comparison to many other of these famous James Cook landing sites, this place has remained relatively untouched. The huge Aotearoa tree here is thought to be about 700 to 800 years old, and it was already a mature tree when Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander and Tupaia, who I'll talk about later, set up their main sort of natural history desk underneath it. So it's quite sort of extraordinary that a living thing still exists from this particular time. So although these events have been discussed at length by historians of science who have tended to concentrate on Cook's astronomical observations and interests in surveying the precise location, and anthropologists who have undertaken substantial analysis of the clash between Maori and European knowledge systems and the numerous ethnographic objects collected, the process of naming and classifying the natural history of the Pacific has remained somewhat neglected. Although substantial attention has been paid to the numerous vocabularies of Polynesian words collected by Joseph Banks, Sidney Parkinson, and others, few attempts have actually been made to analyse the processes of integrating these particular lists as appear in the journals with the practices of actually accumulating and arranging information on the natural world. So using the case of New Zealand, I hope to show here how the consistent integration of information sourced from Maori communities shaped European classifications of species and remained central to the practices of gathering and classifying information on the natural world. And I also hope to show how some of these earlier documents from the 1760s actually had a substantial afterlife that lasts well into the 19th. I won't go into the 20th, but certainly well into the 19th century. Joseph Banks is perhaps the most famous of the naturalists to accompany Cook's voyage. You can't see it, but Banks is at the top of the pyramid of knowledge production, as I've decided to portray it, and he really overshadows his team. So you've got also the Linnaean apostle Daniel Solander, then you've got the next kind of ranking of the skilled artisans, Helen Spurling, the naturalist, Sidney Parkinson, relatively well-known artist, and Alexander Buchanan, the landscape artist, and then you've also got the collectors as well. These individuals would distribute to cover as wide a geographical area as possible. Briscoe and Roberts were actually servants originally from one of Joseph Banks' estates, and Dalton and Richmond are very sort of curious people. There's very, very little known about them, apart from that they were of African descent and Joseph Banks employed them in London. And this system really was why they were able to collect over 30,000 specimens over the course of this voyage and successfully preserve and record them. I think nearly 3,000 of that, so 10%, were regarded as new species to European natural history. And you get a good impression, because of the extraordinary level of preservation of the material, of how they actually kept them, which was in, fine laid paper, but it was in old offprints for books. This is the notes upon the 12 books of Paradise Lost collected in the Spectator, supplied by Banks's friend John Baskerville, and then also there's the paper used for the various manuscripts and the illustrations, which is almost exclusively that produced by James Watman's Kent-based paper mill in the 1750s. There was another large body of material as well that Banks and his team took on the endeavour, and this was a substantial library of natural history books dating from the 16th century to the most recent volume of Buffon's Histoire Naturelle and a few other things of that nature. So Banks's social hierarchy and its alignment with the paper structures used to catalogue, classify and record and collect information becomes most apparent when describing species identified as new to European natural history. The first manuscripts used to record plants and animals were Solander's field notebooks, a series of small quarto volumes arranged according to each major geographical locality they visited. These, especially those covering Polynesia and New Zealand, are packed with signs of engagement with Indigenous people and were filled with descriptions as Solander observed and sorted specimens in the field and on board the ship. Systems for incorporating information supplied by the various Indigenous groups had been standardised since the time the Endeavour arrived in the Society Islands in 1769. And this is some of Daniel Solander's notes that he took in Tahiti, and you can see them translating across various English names and Latin names for plant parts with phonetic words in Tahitian. Central to this process was their meeting of Tupaia, an incredibly famous individual, obviously, in the literature now, a Ratayan priest who travelled with Banks and Solander on the Endeavour from Tahiti until his death in Batavia. This, the knowledge that Tupaia possessed of the natural world, as his ranking really as a quite high-ranking priest in Tahitian society, ensured that he was actually integrated quite successfully within Banks's hierarchy to a level quite similar to that of Daniel Solander. And James Cook's many complaints about Tupaia are basically a result of another body taking up space in the great cabin on the ship. And many of the other artisans, the lower levels in that period, did not go in that cabin. So it's actually very interesting to see how Tupaia starts to fit within this system. So by the time the Endeavour arrived in New Zealand, Solander's means for incorporating Indigenous names into his notebook were tested by the variety of different languages, dialects, and local uses for species. And as Salmond has outlined, Tupaia soon proved his worth to Cook by avoiding a serious conflict with the local Maori, facilitating detailed communication. Cook made port in a place the naturalists called Aotearoa that Cook renamed Poverty Bay on the 7th of October 1769. After it was safe to go on shore, Solander went about collecting plant specimens on the 9th and 10th of October 1769 and described these in his notebook entitled the Plante Australe. Tupaia's ability to communicate with local people resulted in the addition of a wealth of expertise as an accomplished traveller, really, and he quickly, it's extraordinary, he must have been incredibly adept with various languages, but it was he very, very quickly started to master the sound shifts between the various Polynesian languages he was accustomed with and the Maori languages. Pippa myristicum, the page description for which I have up here, represents a typical binomial name Solander ascribed to a species from New Zealand, under which he gave phonetic transcriptions of the Indigenous names, Takawawa and Chawa Chawa, you can see them listed there. And the little codes here relate to the geographical distribution of this particular plant, which he lists in the label in the front cover of his notebook. So POV stands for Poverty Bay, and OP stands for Aotearoa, which I mentioned at the beginning of this particular talk, which is a peninsula in Mercury Bay. We now actually know this species most commonly by a variant of its Maori name, Kawa Kawa. So this is just to mark the two localities on Cook's map as to where this particular examples of this specimen come from. So alternate Indigenous names provided a certain level of synonymy for Daniel Solander to actually produce a Latin binomial. The medicinal use of Pippa myristicum by the Maori, who used it to make a medical ointment. You can actually still buy it in jars in New Zealand. It's very good on eczema on my hands, for example. Observations, and it also incorporates observations of its very strong smell. And the name myristicum actually relates directly to the Greek word myristikos, in reference to its fragrance and use in making ointment. So you can see how this information is actually, well, you can actually see in the text how someone is incorporating this information, and he constantly edits it as well in this particular notebook. So after compiling these notebooks, things become more systematic. the notebooks are literally written on his knee, usually on the beach. This is written back on board the ship. It's still, however, a process of editing and refining information. This is a really fascinating system that Linnaeus was also using at this time, called a manuscript slip catalogue. And they were basically served almost like index cards. So the information on the slips was extracted and taken into the manuscript slip catalogue. Then they could be ordered according to the system of Linnaeus. And you see here, you've got a brief, condensed description that we call a diagnosis, going down to reference to the image, but then you've also got an even more extensive list of Maori words. But in addition to that, we've also got an even more extensive list of localities in which they found it. So this system was constantly expanding, and the slips helped facilitate that. In a bound notebook, you could not just rip out all the pages and rebind them. The nearest binder was somewhere probably up in South America somewhere. But so this actually presented Solander with a means for overcoming the problems of essentially what people call an information overload. You also see him incorporating other information into these slips. Knowing whether a plant was good to eat by the time you'd run out of food was obviously of utmost importance, and these are mostly pronunciations from about, I think, 6 or 7 Polynesian islands. The manuscript slips, after they had been ordered, were initially ordered in line with the Linnaean sexual system of classification according to geographical locality. They were then presented by a man called Herman Sparling, who someone had originally hired in London to work at the British Museum, who basically acted as their natural history secretary. The combined content of these slips and Solander's notebooks was then essentially transcribed into these manuscripts. So you essentially have a Linnaean inventory of flora of New Zealand, and they also transcribed the indigenous names into the top part there. The other things that Sparling was doing simultaneously was annotating Banks and Solander's interleaved copy of the species Plantarum, great Linnaean work intended to encompass the botany of the entire globe. It's a really interesting book. It's meant to be 2 volumes. Banks has had it interleaved to the extent that it's now 6 volumes. You can see Sparling's hand throughout this. You can actually see Pippa Migristicum up at the top there, and here's just a zoomed in version. And the little note MSCR star just references it to the other manuscripts within the collection. It's basically a sign. Look at these manuscripts, and you'll go then to the correct genera and the species, and you'll be able to locate it. So by the time they left, they essentially had a full kind of book manuscript. The little things which I pointed out earlier in the slip, it also carries through into the annotated book, is the little term figura picta, which means that Sidney Parkinson was employed to produce an illustration of this particular species. Parkinson did not always complete his images, and for some species, he did not produce an image. So it actually shows that Banks and Solander and Parkinson, combined usually, were willing to dedicate time and limited resources to depict this particular plant, which they nearly always reserved for plants that they regarded to be of particular economic or medicinal use within the local populations that they encounter. So the pattern of which drawings or illustrations actually were produced during this voyage is quite significant. The really interesting thing I noticed actually in New Zealand, very close to the spot in Aotearoa, is that nearly all of these images are also composites. There's a male and female variety of the Kalakaua, or Pippa Migristicum, as Solander called it. That's the female variety, that's the male variety, which obviously pollinates, and they morphed it together, or Parkinson morphed it together within this particular illustration. You see this in quite a lot of these drawings as well. Perhaps the most notable, which I don't think anyone's really noticed this before, is the breadfruit. All of those famous pictures of the breadfruit from this voyage are composites of the male and female variety of the species. And it's remarkable that that image became more or less standardised representation for that species, even though it was not actually strictly accurate according to the systems that it came to be used in the early part of the 19th century. The other thing that they did, you'll see the holes in the leaves, commonly caused by the kawa moth. This is a specimen, again, full of the same holes, made by the same moth, and they obviously perfected all of the leaves to emit this particular damage. That is a much more common practice of period. So the collections that Banks's team made, essentially they came back to London with a full book manuscript already written, and we all know that they went about producing this Florilegium that never happened, and I've written about that elsewhere. But what I'm going to talk about now is the actual active afterlives of this material. It was visited by numerous individuals. Linnaeus the Younger, for example, published some of the descriptions in his Systema Plantarum. You also have other Polynesian travellers, Mai, who gives a very, very famous picture by Parry, Mai, who came to London on Cook's second voyage. And you see Solander actively citing information from Mai throughout the botanical manuscripts. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation about this picture as to what's going on, but frankly, this is Banks's very grand depiction of the social hierarchy, and frankly, this is what Solander is writing. Banks sees himself obviously as the boss, like he did during the voyage. So among the other people who viewed this particular collection was Robert Brown, who in 1803 travelled to New Holland on HMS Investigator under the command of Matthew Flinders. Brown made his name on this voyage, gathering huge volumes of information that went towards his development of a new natural system of classification based on a far broader range of physical characters such as leaves and fruit, in addition to a plant's geographical distribution and use in these places when compared to the earlier Linnaean system. However, the question remains as to the extent this was solely a construct of what some people term as Western scientific thought, in an age that saw the collection of more species deemed new to European natural history than ever before or since. In addition to his own specimens and descriptions, Brown received numerous specimens from Australia, and after the death of Banks's curator in 1810, was appointed to that position, placing him at probably the centre of probably the largest botanical network in the Anglophone world, and this resulted in his publication of the Prodromus Florae Novae Hollandia Insulae van Diemen in 1810, that remains a foundational work on natural systems and classification, and also became an important tool used by naturalists when classifying the flora of Australia and the Pacific more broadly. Among the people who sent stuff back to Brown was a man called Alan Cunningham, who, under Banks's patronage, became the King's botanist for Kew Gardens, who arrived in New South Wales in 1816. And this is a really fascinating manuscript that Cunningham sent this list in addition to all the specimens back to Brown. Brown is then interleaving the list, and many of the divisions you see actually fit in with his prodromus. So you can see him either editing, but sometimes you don't see him editing at all. It's merely an act of transfer. And I'm just going to talk about next how Cunningham came to some of these conclusions. Cunningham's archive is huge. It's meticulous as well. He was originally trained as a surveyor, which is why we see, like this, for example, such neatly tabulated notes on every single thing that he came across, in addition to the maps that he drew. This is just some detail of map New South Wales, and this is again the Brisbane River. He can actually tabulate where he was collecting things with the manuscript, essentially ledgers. That's what he was producing. Another thing Cunningham did consistently was record vocabularies that came from the people who he encountered. This is a very interesting one actually that he recorded in Tasmania when he visited with King in 1818. Something that I was pretty surprised to see at the end of last year, it was listed as a printed book, was Cunningham's own copy of Brown's Prodromus. Interestingly, however, it's not a printed book. It's actually a direct transcription in some cases of everything that was in the original printed version. Some of it's actually in the hand of Cunningham's brother, who was also a botanist in the region. The really interesting thing about this is that appended at the back, there's a huge number of indices that Cunningham has produced that reflect on the development of natural orders and natural classifications. But you also see how naming and binomials were being actively produced. So, as I mentioned earlier on, Solander was using Greek really as the sort of transient point to move between various indigenous languages, and then the Latin binomial. And you see that Cunningham is actually doing exactly the same, only perhaps in a slightly more sophisticated manner, for very particular plant parts usually. And you see them actually, they're much broader areas of identification when compared to that being used by Solander. So this is an item that Cunningham sent to Robert Brown. That he sent to Robert Brown from New Zealand that he visited in 1826. And you can see how he's systematically integrating Maori names into the names and often the descriptions. So you've got here, you might not be able to see it, it's a bit blurred, but he describes, to quote the native name, pronounced Toa, that's his phonetic transcription, and then he's actually named the plant Laurus Toa at the top. So the actual name, then I think Brown actually went on to publish this particular name, does come out. And the etymological route, it's very interesting to see how that remains in this particular naming practice. And you see this to go to the herbarium sheets that Cunningham produced as well. You see multiple examples. This is one here that has got a native name, then the phonetic spelling of it, Bay of Islands in New Zealand. This is from his voyage up there. Something I would never thought that I would actually find an item like this that came to light again when I was in New South Wales is Cunningham's actual pocket notebook from this particular trip. And it's I think it's so important to go and actually look at some of this stuff instead of looking at it online. If I just saw that, I'd be thinking, okay, it's probably some book, you know, I don't really know the dimensions. It's a little tiny thing like what a police officer would use that goes into your pocket and then you open it up to take notes. It is absolutely packed full of Maori. And the really interesting thing, in addition to containing a good narrative of what he's doing on a daily basis, is in the preliminary notes, is you actually have the broad division for species which reflect on the actual structure of forest as the Maori were communicating with him and showing him around. And he actually said at another later point that he's actually shown around by the native guides, and this is how to look at strata of the particular kinds of ferns. So you've actually got Kawakawa at the top there. That was one more prominent plant in the New Zealand forest. Then you've got the transcription, for example, tree fern, climbing fern, Philium, you know, you've got multiple plants as they basically appear within these forests. And, you know, New Zealand is a good place to be doing this and to start breaking down the Linnaean system, because it's basically full of cryptograms and nobody knew, even Linnaeus had no idea really of how to arrange those. This is, I'm just about to wrap up. Oh yes. Yeah, I'll wrap up in a second. So this is what came out of these particular notebooks. This is Cunningham's Flora of New Zealand, which he produced in Britain, actually. He went back to Britain in the early 1830s and had exclusive access to Banks's manuscripts as well. So all of the information he was collecting, in addition to that published by various French, German expeditions, and the stuff in the Banksian library, was all combined into this particular manuscript that he then prefaces with a geographical introduction. And you see him write in this particular introduction, to quote, "Case has been taken to note the particular localities at which a plant has been found, as also to give chronologically the date at which it has been gathered by botanists, in order that the discoverer may be duly accredited for his researches whilst in the field." And this is what you see in this particular book, which is all rather interesting. It's very similar structure to Solander, but the groupings of plants are different, and you see consistent transcriptions of the indigenous names. This notebook then went back to New Zealand with Cunningham when he visited again in 1838. He actually returned to Sydney because he didn't like the weather in London. That was his main excuse. He said it had a bad effect on his health. Cunningham, interestingly, in the late 1830s, then taught a man called William Colenso how to botanize. Colenso then hosted Charles Darwin for Christmas dinner, so about 6 months later. So that's always quite sort of fun. However, the thing that comes out of this is, whilst he's travelling around the world, William Jackson Hooker, after Cunningham's died, purchases many of these particular manuscripts, and then he goes on to actively publish them. And you still see that the names that Cunningham was recording are then actually being integrated into Hooker's natural system. But the interesting thing that I'm starting to see, and this is fairly early days for this, is the broader divisions being identified are also being incorporated into natural systems in the early 19th century. And using the case study of New Zealand has allowed me to see this, or start to unpick this quite clearly. So to finish off, I hope to have shown that rather than being of sort of singular interest to Europeans, there was actually intense Indigenous engagement with these particular projects. It was a very collaborative affair, and the New Zealand travellers actually relied on the Maori for names and descriptions and the broader sectors of how to divide species. I think it actually represents an important moment in what we see as what we know as the breakdown of the Linnaean system. It also allows us to understand exactly how and why this was starting to happen, but also the contributors that started to make this happen. Finally, this very last thing, I'll just do a plug for an exhibition. So if anyone's visiting London the next sort of 3 weeks or so, do go and see this. And there's quite a number of sort of objects that would certainly be appealing, I think, to members of this this conference on display at the Linnaean Society. So that's everything I'm going to say for now. Thanks a lot.
Super, that's fascinating. We still have some time for questions, and we'll open the floor online, in person. Does anyone have anything they would like to ask? Leslie again.
Sorry.
Quick draw the broad. Nope.
I'm very interested in the collection of the words of the language. Do you see this just as a way to get to the plants? Or is there something more going on there? Is there an anthropological?
There's everything. It's interesting how it is often restricted, but that notebook is full of everything. So I didn't show you the page before, which is he's actually drawn a picture of a shell fishhook, and also named that in several different dialects. So there's also whole discussions of the culture and the way that the way those technologies of that nature are actively used within the society. So it's quite interesting. It's fundamentally integrated, I think, at the initial moment that he's there, which is what this notebook represents. Then what we see in the later manuscripts, as like with Banks, as they're sorting through, you see this division of various sort of strands of knowledge. So botany goes in one place, and then sort of anthropological materials and observations go in another place. The other thing, in addition to that plant list that he sent to Robert Brown, was a beautifully transcribed version of his daily journal, and he does that for every single trip. So you do see this, how the information is separated into categories more generally at this time as well.
And do you think he's trying to learn to speak the language or?
Yes, something I should have mentioned as well, he had interpreters out there. By the 1830s, there were plenty of missionary colonies in the Bay of Islands. Williams, who constructed the dictionary, was already there. So he had a lot of help on that side, much more so than what, for example, Joseph Banks would have received.
Yes, I'm sorry, I can't see, it's so dark.
Thanks for the presentation. So the impression I got from the paper is almost one of a relatively smooth portrayal of knowledge and specimens accumulating relatively smoothly in the works of European collectors. All the while, earlier today, we heard about how complex a process translation can be, that occurs at several levels, right? So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the frictions, the challenges involved in managing this system of accumulation.
Yeah.
And perhaps also about the power relations involved. You mentioned, there's indigenous engagement, there's evidence of indigenous engagement and collaboration. So can you tell us a bit more about the power relations involved in the actual encounter and perhaps about what happens to indigenous knowledge in that process?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the indigenous knowledge, to start at the end of your question, is thoroughly sorted by people like Robert Brown. And it's interesting, something I perhaps should have said, I'm still working out, and I suspect this might well be the case, that Brown wasn't actually conscious of incorporating these systems into the final published products, which is, I think, very interesting to see how information and the attributions disappear as information is sorted. For the beginning of your question, these encounters were obviously at the centre of a very tense, usually political and economic situations. With Banks, it was perhaps more dramatic because it was the sort of the first major sustained engagement, but with the later period, you do start to see, the more you see, certainly, the Maori had very good reasons for communicating with various Europeans, particularly in regions like the Bay of Islands, mainly because the Europeans, if they helped the Europeans would sell them things like guns, and then they could invade essentially the next kingdom over. So there were very clear motivations for engaging with these projects at particular times. I also think the other thing which becomes really interesting in terms of the stories of the actual people is in the later period again religion, and that starts to come in, and I think Christianity and its emergence and its actual it does seem to combine more smoothly with Maori customs than in other cultures, which is always surprising, and there's a good display actually on at the Auckland Museum about that at the moment. But something I was thinking of is that a lot of the sort of interests in interacting with nature were viewed by the missionaries also as a matter of survival. And they certainly took these tribes and made political allegiances with these tribes. I hope that sort of starts to answer some of your questions, but it is a very complicated situation that emerges. I perhaps paint over a bit too swiftly in this particular talk as to how things happened, rather than going perhaps more into the social side of things.
Right, well, that brings us to time. Thanks to both of our speakers for excellent talks, and those in person, we have coffee again. Those online, we can find your own coffee, and we have another fundraiser coming up in a short 15 minutes. Thank you both so much.